I've come via a number of countries, actually. Educated in Australia, actually in a tiny little school. Generally the view is you don't leave that community, but I did. And went on to further university studies in Perth in Western Australia. And then I made a decision to go abroad and do a PhD. And what was interesting at that point is typically women didn't. They did PhDs part-time and men went abroad. And it's also interesting, there was a very strong view also that probably the PhDs to get should be ones abroad. So that tells you something about countries that have been colonised. Okay? And probably likely you'd see that also in the Latin American world. You've got to go somewhere else to get a PhD. So I got a PhD in Canada in politics, sociology, and went back to Australia, but I ended up over in the University of Auckland, New Zealand, and it was a wonderful department and a wonderful experience because essentially there, Māori politics, so it's the Indigenous population. Many Australians like to think New Zealand's just a bit like Australia, just happened to float off. It's so different, and it really challenges you when you have these different experiences living and working in different places to actually see the specificity of place, politics, culture, history as it comes together. End of 1999, I came to the UK and University of Bristol, and then more recently I've been in Cambridge the last 3 years, now currently head of the faculty. And being in the UK has been very interesting for me because it's given me an opportunity not just to work on regional integration projects, which have been fantastically interesting, and global processes, but I think there's ways in which destinations, doctoral students particularly, and you find yourself going back to visit your doctoral students. It's opened up a Latin American world, so I've spent quite a bit of time, and next week actually, going down to Brazil to speak at a conference.
And then moving on to the concept of science diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
How do you understand that concept? And is it something that you come across in your field?
I do come across science diplomacy. It often comes with several different names as well. It might come in the form of education diplomacy or science diplomacy. I know when Hillary Clinton first went across into the world of China, it was to take science policy and diplomacy across. China talks about soft power, and it might use science diplomacy or education diplomacy and so on. I've seen that activity in relation to education a lot. When the European Union, particularly the Commission, wanted to become much more visible in the Asian world, it used education activity as a way of doing that. Because in a way, no one's against, education. You might be against an army coming in or something like this, but when you go in and you want to set up programs, share knowledge, education programs, share knowledge, curriculum, and so on, then that's typically seen as a good thing, that everyone benefits, everyone shares. It's about a good investment in the world. Perhaps the iteration of that I've been looking at more closely, I'd maybe say Science Without Borders, Brazil, major initiative and its students coming up, that was part of science diplomacy. China more recently with the so-called Belt and Road, Confucius Institutes and so on. It's engaged in science diplomacy. What do I think of that? I was asked about that more recently from the Times Higher. One thing I would say about academics and education is there is, look at this conference, wonderful curiosity, willing to learn from each other, people from different parts of the world. So in a sense, I think there's, for sure, there's particular knowledges that are being promoted because part of that is about that. But at the same time, it has to come with people like students, like academics, people who are deeply invested in particular knowledge traditions, who are often very keen, willing to share, want to learn. So it's a two-sided thing, I kind of think.
And sort of building on to that, how do you think that scientific international collaboration could then be used as a tool in the educational field in a successful way?
Well, I think talking about it as collaboration, too often I think there's a World Bank model. We take out this knowledge here that we've manufactured here, and then we impose that. And we saw that pretty much in the 1980s with structural adjustment programs and so on. That there was one way to do things, and I think there is still a very strong sense of one way to do things. So in the world of education, that it's got to be choice, markets, competition, high stakes testing, and so on. But there are other models, and I think that's where, in a genuine diplomacy environment, in other words, a more collaborative environment, if we were genuine and open to learning about what happens elsewhere, how do others do things, what are the gains and so on, who gets to play and so on, then I think we become a much more richer world with more solutions on the table rather than one. One that's kind of being as a kind of proselytizing solution. And I feel the current state of the world, climate change, our aging population, demographic shifts. Some countries, for example, their populations are declining. Japan, good example. And so on. Not so much the Latin American world, but how do we get bigger solutions on the table? And I think they come out of putting our knowledges together and seeing them as a collective resource rather than something that's part of a politics of imposition.
And do you think that there are elements from education or from the educational field that you have observed that should be implemented into international collaboration? Like, what can we take from the educational field?
I think if I look at, of course there are lots of wonderful best practices, or good practices, not best, good practices. And I've been in, multiple forums, Africa, Latin America and so on. I think the Latin American world particularly, the landless peasant movements and so on, they've been amazing innovations. I've been fortunate to, sometimes be in UNESCO forums, and they bring in, individuals who have, have been thoughtful, imaginative, working with their communities, often in really challenging circumstances, to, significantly improve what's going on in their communities. And Porto Alegre was an interesting example of that hosted the World Social Forum. But what they did there, essentially, was through the citizen schools and so on, kind of radically improve, children's performance. Okay, and the question of, and not with massive new resources, simply about doing things differently. And they're things, I share those examples with my students that I teach, for example, here, because that kind of adds to just a different way in which we can think. I think we need more of those, though. I think there's a very strong presence of World Bank, OECD, multilateral organisations who, impose pretty much a one-size-fits-all kind of solution on the table. But in Latin America, CLACSO, which is an organisation that's based in Argentina that I have something to do with, which is the Latin American Education Consortium, it's often looking at south-south. So rather than go south-north, what could we, if we looked south-south, could we also see completely different, interesting, other, less observed, take India for example, activity that is something we could learn from.
You have an experience, as you just mentioned, like working with the students here at the University of Cambridge.
Yes.
And here at the Shaping Horizons Summit, we have gathered young people, or future leaders, as we refer to them as, the age group between 18 and 32, to work with the innovation process. And what do you see as the challenges and opportunities of working with this age group?
Well, at one level, it'd be holding them back. They are just a wonderful resource, and I've been completely inspired. Not just the fact that this summit's happening, and that it's happening with, I think, a pedagogical project In other words, when I say that, what I mean is it's been very thoughtful about how it wants to engage those individuals both in a dialogue and in a future-making project. And I think that's incredibly exciting. And I think when I look at, I think we don't value and use the younger generation enough. Perhaps Greta Thunberg, and thinking about, she's the young activist to do with climate change. She's been inspirational, and it hasn't taken much, has it? Here in Cambridge, young school children have been out demonstrating and saying, we are the future. We want to be a part of the solution making for the future. So perhaps in Cambridge, I think, seeing, and I see this amongst the young people and sometimes older people that come to study at Cambridge, undergraduate or graduate programs, is giving them permission to seize the future, to actually engage them. I know we, for example, when we meet our doctoral students, they run orientation. Why not? When they first arrive in that first week, it's not something. We choose them to study here, and we choose them because they are leaders, organisers, community activists, shapers, and so on. So why not work alongside them, not set ourselves up in a kind of we say you do relationship. So I think we need more of that, and I think this summit is just a great tribute to young people and young students here in Cambridge and so on, organising that.
And another aspect to the people here is that some of them are from the UK and some from Latin America. Yeah. And how do you think that Shaping Horizons, but also like other initiatives like it, how can this type of innovation and international scientific collaboration be used as a tool to foster diplomatic relations between the UK and Latin America?
Well, many relations work out of friendships, don't they? And what we know in the education world is that you maybe move across institutions, or you might come and study at a particular place because there's connections and so on. And my sense is that those will often be lasting connections. So how do we maintain those connections, those networks, those friendships? How do we if you look at Harvard, for example, it'll actually have listed who's been studied at Harvard and who's now, a head of state, for example. So how to continue those things into the future? I just think it's fabulous. You've got funding. How, great that actually they've seen that this is something that's both worth investing in and worth, it seems to me, reinvesting in different iterations, different versions of this kind of thing. So I think that's the two UK to Latin America. I think quite often we don't. The UK might often look at its old kind of colonial kind of relationships and not necessarily to what's kind of regarded as below the United States. So setting up these new relationships, but many Latin American students study in the UK. I've had the privilege of supervising many. I've had the privilege and currently have the privilege of a postdoc scholar from Brazil with me. So perhaps education's very well placed to do this kind of thing.
And from a more personal perspective, when you found out about Shaping Horizons and we asked you to come here and speak, what was it that made you accept that invitation?
Well, I know one of the organisers, and probably a good 12 months ago he was talking to me about this initiative, and so I think I've been 200% enthusiastic. I think I have a very strong sense that we need to depend more and more on the imagination of the younger generation to think our way out of what I think are decisions that haven't, I think, delivered on what I would regard as a healthy society. So yes, I'd put my hand up instantly.
Well,
to do it again.
we are very grateful that you did, and thank you so much.